you. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to all of you to this session entitled Trusting the Messenger, where do young Canadians turn for scientific information they can believe. Bienvenue à toutes les participantes, bienvenue à tous les participants à cet atelier intitulé Faire confiance aux messagers où les jeunes Canadiens vont pour trouver de l'information scientifique qu'ils peuvent croire. Je m'appelle Jean-Pierre Perrault, je préside l'ACFAS. C'est une association qui a pour mission de promouvoir la science, l'innovation et la culture scientifique dans l'espace francophone au Canada et dans le monde. Et ce matin, j'ai le mandat de lancer cette session de travail. My name is Jean-Pierre Perrault. I chair the administration board of the ACFAS, an association that has for mission to promote science, innovation, scientific culture in the French space. And this morning, I have the mandate to start this session. I believe that you already understand that we will interact in French as well as in English, so do not hesitate for any questions. This session is the result of a collaboration between HACFAS and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge Roseanne O'Reilly-Rountree, President and CEO of CFI, and her team for this opportunity to work together. Roseanne will also be our moderator for this session. As you know, the CFI has a mandate to fund research infrastructure and increase the capacity of university, college, hospital, and nonprofit research institutions to pursue international research and technological development activities that produce benefits for Canadians. As a key player in Canada research ecosystem, the CFI is committed to supporting science, education, and scientific literacy among Canadian young. A positive new generation perception of research is essential for the future of science and innovation in our country. Alors, afin de mettre en lumière la relation qui existe entre les jeunes Canadiens et la science, ainsi que leurs sources privilégiées d'informations scientifiques, la FCI a embauché la firme Ipsos pour effectuer un sondage sur les attitudes des jeunes à l'égard des sciences et sur les conditions et les personnes qui les influencent. Cette initiative a été mise en œuvre en partenariat avec l'ACFAS. Bien que l'ACFAS concentre son action sur les collectivités francophones, l'initiative s'adressera aussi à la jeunesse anglophone. La culture scientifique n'a jamais été aussi importante dans notre société. Ce sondage se tient dans un environnement public dans lequel les réseaux sociaux, les fausses nouvelles et les sources peu fiables influencent fortement le développement d'attitudes et de systèmes de valeurs qui vont accompagner les jeunes toute leur vie et avoir une incidence directe sur leur choix de carrière sanitaire et sociétaux. This information should help policymakers, educational institutions, and other stakeholders in the research community in their effort to support and promote science education and culture in Canada. Therefore, the data from this survey should be of great interest to all of us, and I will invite all of us to think about what needs to be done to correct the situations. This is a very important question if we or you want to communicate with these new generations. On that, I will now turn the mic to Roseanne O'Reilly-Rountree. Please, Roseanne.
Merci, Monsieur Perrault. Et vous avez très bien mis la table, mais vous ne vous êtes pas trop bien présenté vous-même. Monsieur Perrault est président de l'ACFAS. Il est vice-recteur à la recherche et aux études supérieures de l'Université Sherbrooke. Et il a un doctorat de l'Université de Montréal, postdoctorat de Yale. Il est spécialiste en biologie moléculaire. Il a eu beaucoup de bourses et de distinctions, mais comme président de la FCI, je remarque surtout la bourse qu'il a reçue de la FCI pour la recherche sur le cancer. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to collaborate with ACFAS and with you. The CFI is having its 25th anniversary. One of our parts of our strategic plan was collaboration, and ACFAS couldn't be a better partner with which to collaborate. Um, we also didn't want to just look back and say what we've done for the last 25 years, although we can look across the country and see so many wonderful things that have been built and so many wonderful projects that have been realized and so many young researchers who are now professors and who have students themselves across the country. But we wanted to look at the future and say, what about that next generation? What's going to happen 25 years from now? And who better to tell us than the youth of that generation? So, for talking about les défis pour la société, on a invité M. Philippe Mongrain de l'Université de Montréal. Il est doctorant en Sciences Po. Il est boursier de la bourse Bombardier, la bourse du Crush, la bourse du FRSQ. Et il est vraiment célèbre, et je vais le dire en anglais, for having produced models for predicting election results. Now, I think that he should be in a high demand every few years across the country, from provinces, municipalities, all the way to the federal government. And my goodness, there could even be an international career for you. So, Philippe, qu'est-ce que vous avez à dire sur le sondage?
En fait, je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, je vais peut-être m'introduire en français. Donc, comme vous l'avez mentionné, je suis étudiant au doctorat en sciences politiques à l'Université de Montréal et effectivement, mon domaine de prédilection, c'est la prédiction électorale. Donc, c'est un peu loin de la confiance envers les sciences ou les scientifiques. Mais bon, j'ai fait ce travail-là pour l'ACFAS et je suis très heureux aujourd'hui de présenter en fait la revue littérature que j'ai pu effectuer pour l'ACFAS. Et donc, que je vais présenter aujourd'hui, c'est un peu plus global que le sujet sur lequel porte le sondage, qui est directement axé sur les jeunes Canadiens. Mais j'espère quand même que les résultats ou en fait les découvertes que je vais présenter aujourd'hui dans la littérature vont pouvoir informer notre discussion. Et donc, si vous le voulez bien, je vais commencer ma présentation que je vais faire en anglais. So as I just said, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Montreal. And about a year ago, I was asked by the ACFAS to produce a literature review on the relationship between different variables and confidence in science. So I'm going to provide this broad overview, and hopefully this will inform the discussion we will have today. Most of the work on the issue of science legitimacy in the United States and Europe has mostly focused on the relationship between knowledge of science and attitudes towards science and scientists. And what we find is that low science literacy usually lead to pre-modern or even anti-scientific ideas that could be, in some cases, conducive to conspiracy theories. But actually, research seems to show that the scientific knowledge of citizens has only a minimal effect on their attitudes towards science. And a number of researchers have actually criticized research on the relationship between science knowledge and confidence of citizens in science and scientists. So the positive relationship between knowledge and trust in science seems to be related only to global attitudes about science. So things like science causes society to change too fast, and not really to attitudes about specific issues such as cloning or global warming or vaccines. And also the very notion of trust in the general public is being questioned in favor of more ethnographic studies that target different segments of the population. So there are a lot of researchers that believe that we cannot talk about trust in science public, but we have to segment the population. Other research have also proposed that negative attitudes towards science may result from a crisis of modernity. And so the increase of societies on the knowledge of the experts and technocrats is believed to create a sense of alienation among citizens. Citizens are not necessarily part of the decisional processes that lead to some of um, the, the, the decisions they are exposed to. And one of the biggest question, of course, is who trusts scientists? And oh, sorry, I think I went too fast there. So the benefits of modernity that scientific advances have led people to believe that public confidence in science was destined to follow an upward curve among all subgroups in society. And it has also been argued that scientific literacy would necessarily lead to an increase in confidence in science. And at the aggregate level, we see that more educated societies do tend to have a higher level of trust, but actually the expansion of schooling in these societies does not seem to have resulted in an increase in trust in science. And this is because other factors weigh as much, if not more, than education on citizens' attitude towards science. And we can think about, obviously, religion or political orientation. And in that citizens and elites have with science is often linked to political, social, and economic interests. And the confrontation between conservative ideology and scientific enterprise can be explained by a number of incompatibilities. For example, the traditionalist values of the conservative ideology do not really fit well with the constant questioning that characterizes scientific work, and also the primacy of free enterprise and the ideal of the minimalist state and non-intervention of the state um, um, often conflict with science-based regulation policies, for example, on the environment or healthcare. Um, Also, the conservative ideology is associated with a greater rejection of science when science is primarily concerned with risk management, but with greater confidence or acceptance of science as a tool for production and economic growth. And also, citizens tend to evaluate the risk management function of the scientific then so this can give the attitudes of citizens and their beliefs in science or their confidence in science. But still, the trust gap between liberal and conservative persists for many research areas, whether it is vaccines, climate change, nuclear energy, or GMOs. So it does not really depend on a specific issue. Also, of course, religion is a variable that can influence citizens' confidence in science. So, religious groups are also more likely, by virtue of their very beliefs, to challenge scientific theories and findings. An individual, for example, who displays low level of trust in science and scientists are more likely to reject the theory of evolution. Also, there is a study in the US that shows that trust in the scientific community has hardly declined since the 1970s, except among individuals who identify as conservative and those who often go to church. An important question nowadays is media consumption and the information citizens are exposed to. We know that the kind of media someone consumes can have impact on his or her confidence in science. So the use of conservative media in the United States has been found to reduce individuals' trust in scientists, which can also create some skepticism about the existence of climate change or the dangerousness of vaccines, for example, whereas the exposure to liberal media would have the opposite effect. And also, we are in an era of increasing fragmentation of the media landscape. And this fragmentation kind of undermines consensus building and compromise about major issues. And we know that consensus or the perception of consensus in the scientific community is really important for citizens to believe in scientific claims. Uh, Also, a lot of researchers are concerned about the dissemination of conspiracy theories or misleading information online because more and more citizens are coming into contact with information on the internet, on unconventional sources of informations, and some studies have found that exposure to fake information or misleading information can lead citizens to make bad decisions in terms of their attitudes or health. Um, we and also those who trust scientists more or less likely to view false claim about either the virus, the coronavirus, or the environment as credible. Um, so obviously, it's hard not to talk about the COVID-19, and one of the most interesting finding in the literature is that citizens' attitudes towards science are apparently largely impervious to events such as pandemic. So uh, research on that subject were made before the COVID-19 pandemic, so I'm not sure the results are still valid. But still, it appears that going through a pandemic or experiencing climate change do not really affect citizens' attitude towards science. Also, some research has shown that media-supported scientific breakthroughs, such as the development of to an increase in trust in science, but apparently the increase in trust is very short-lived. Um, I just said that citizens are not really influenced by events, but apparently that's not the case about for younger people. So a study has shown that individuals who experience a pandemic in early adulthood, so the 18 to 25-year-old group, are more likely to express doubts about the integrity and safety of science. This relationship is uh, even stronger among young individuals who have poor education. So maybe the COVID-19 pandemic will have lasting impacts on some citizens' attitudes about science, but mainly the younger generation. And also an interesting finding is that the recommendation of scientists in the face of a risk situation uh, uh, will will generate some resistance among citizens if citizens have to make big changes in their lives or if it requires drastic changes. Uh, so I'm not exactly sure if this is what we have observed in Canada for the COVID-19 pandemic, but still it's a pretty logical finding. And that's about it. But obviously, I can go into further details later on in the discussion if some participants have questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mongrain. That was really fascinating, and what an interesting context into which to place the survey that we have done with ACFAS and Ipsos on young people in Canada today. See how they fit in those past world trends. And for that purpose, I'd like to introduce Sébastien Dallard, qui est le premier vice-président pour le Canada et directeur général pour le Québec chez Ipsos. Il est également professeur à Concordia et il est bien connu pour ses interviews radiophoniques. Et il va parler des données spécifiques de ce sondage que nous annonçons aujourd'hui Alors, today you are the first people to hear the results of the survey that was done in Canada today and see how that survey fits with the findings of the past. So, Monsieur Dallaire, je vous donne la parole. Could you be on mute? Okay, we're having a momentary technical hitch here, and so we're going to move right on to Catherine Girard, qui est directrice du laboratoire du patrimoine microbiome au département des sciences fondamentales de l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi. Elle a reçu son doctorat à l'Université de Montréal. Elle a fait ses études postdoctorales à l'Université Laval. Elle a travaillé dans l'Arctique avec les communautés sur les questions de la santé. Elle est boursière Fulbright. Elle a étudié au Texas avec l'organisation Fulbright. Elle s'occupe de dossiers d'une importance extrême, la santé humaine et la santé de l'écosystème de l'Arctique. Catherine, il est toujours un grand plaisir de vous présenter. It's a real privilege to present Catherine, who is a young researcher, but an important researcher doing extremely important work today. And she's going to talk a little bit about the survey, and we hope that when she's done, you'll actually hear about the survey.
Oh, merci beaucoup, Roseanne. Je vais essayer de ne pas trop divulgacher les résultats pour la suite, mais je vais commencer par remercier la FCI et l'ACFAS de l'invitation de me joindre à ce panel. C'est une très belle opportunité qui m'a été offerte de commenter les résultats d'Ipsos. C'est très intéressant comme sondage. Je remercie les autres panélistes là, pour leur présence. Donc, les jeunes qui ont été invités à répondre au sondage dont on va discuter davantage par la suite ont entre 18 et 24 ans. Donc, moi, je travaille avec des jeunes qui sont plutôt dans la fin de cette gamme d'âge, donc en tant que professeur universitaire. Je côtoie principalement des jeunes début vingtaine qui sont inscrits à l'université en sciences, soit au baccalauréat ou dans un doctorat. C'est certain que les jeunes que je côtoie étant inscrits en sciences sont probablement parmi les plus conscientisés ou les plus intéressés par la science, mais j'ai tout de même reconnu beaucoup des jeunes à qui j'enseigne en fait dans les résultats du sondage. Donc, I was really impressed with the fact that, as you'll see in the survey, that youth really seem to understand that there is solid science out there, but they also understand that there's untrustworthy information being reported as science. And as we'll see later, even though they don't always report themselves as being very good to tease both apart, the fact that they know that they recognize that both exist, that they're not the same, and that they check, for example, if content is sponsored or not was very reassuring to me, both as an educator and as a research scientist. And so I wondered if this may have stemmed from all the conversations we've been having on how to distinguish fact from fake, science from pseudoscience, mostly in social media over the last couple of years during the pandemic. But Philip touched on this during his talk, so maybe the impact of COVID is not as clear as one might expect. So I'm looking forward to maybe discuss this more during the rest of the panel. But in any case, to me, it seems like youth have overall gotten the message, which is something that we don't necessarily see in other age groups who aren't always as good in distinguishing between science and pseudoscience. And I was also pleasantly surprised about the proportion of youth who reported seeking out science-related content on a regular or on an occasional basis. And again, I'm really curious as to how the pandemic may have impacted this behavior or not. So I'm looking forward to discussing this with Philippe later on. What was maybe a little less surprising to me, but that I'm really glad is outlined in the report, is that youth don't seem to use the social media platforms that are typically used by science organizations or universities that try to reach them. So things like Facebook and Twitter, which are pretty common in my institutions, and I suppose in yours as well. These, as you'll see in the results, are actually among the least popular with youth. I think we're catching up as a scientific community with the use of alternative media platforms like podcasts to try and reach youth. But a lot of work still needs to be done on other platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And these results from the survey really resonate with my experiences with the youth I teach. And I think it underscores the need to tailor our approach to communicating with younger people. As a research scientist who specializes in climate change, something that did surprise me was the data on climate, but maybe I can let Sébastien speak on the results of the survey, and we can loop back to this during the rest of the talk. But I was pleasantly surprised about how youth perceived COVID-19 science, and a little disheartened with how they perceived climate change data. But what gave me perhaps the most hope from this survey is that a lot of the youth who engaged with these questions agree that science is based on facts, not opinion, which is really great news for me as a scientist. And they also reported being curious, which is really reassuring too. We saw, we'll see in these results that youth, respect science-based evidence. They judged scientific evidence to be one of the most powerful factors in determining if COVID vaccines were safe or not, for example, which is really reassuring. As we'll see in the results, youth in this survey were broken down into different attitudes, into different personas that were more pro-science or a little more skeptical. And I think we need to find ways to move youth from the middle ground into active promoters of science. I know that students or youth that were involved in the survey who felt the most pro-science were mostly people who were already pursuing a career in STEM, which is very reassuring. We want the next generation of scientists to be advocates for science. But I think we need to also get youth who are not in these career paths to feel welcome to the discussion and to feel like they have a platform and a voice. And a few of the youth, the groups that were more in this middle ground of not necessarily pro-science, not anti-science, a lot of these younger people reported not being good at math, and that this could be associated with greater difficulty in distinguishing between what is science and what is pseudoscience. And this is a trend that we're seeing nationwide, and that I even see in my STEM university students. And to me, it suggests that we're maybe not engaging youth at an early enough age with math, or that we're not engaging with them appropriately. So youth are changing, they're evolving, and the approaches and the methods we use to teach math and science have to evolve with them. And something that was a little worrisome for me from the report, and that I see in the students I teach, was the feeling of embarrassment reported by youth when they felt that someone knew more about a subject than they did, and how they felt feelings of anxiety about learning new things. So this is a huge issue to me and to most scientists, I think. Research is all about seeking out answers, learning continuously, course correcting, questioning what we know. And I think we need to value asking questions, learning, and to underscore that it's all right not to know if you're open to learning. And a way to do this might be by giving more visibility to the scientific approach as a method, so that, to underscore that it all starts with a question that we're asking that we don't necessarily know the answer to. And maybe one of the most important takeaways I have from this, the results that you'll be seeing in a few minutes, are that youth are not a monolith. They're complex individuals in a very heterogeneous group, and this is something Philippe discussed in his talk as well. Youth in remote communities don't see things the same way as those in big cities. Youth from different cultural backgrounds will have distinct views on science and different ways of engaging with it and of informing themselves. And I think it's really critical that we recognize this diversity of opinions and of ways of engaging with science. And you'll see this in the report by how certain results are stratified by geography or language or culture. And this ties into another major takeaway for me, in that youth seem to value peers, people around them, news and media outlets that reflect their own beliefs and culture. And I don't think this is something that's unique to youth, but I'm really glad that it comes out in the survey. And this really resonates with my experiences as a science communicator and educator. So I work in a small university in rural Quebec, but a lot of my work, as Roseanne mentioned, focuses on the Arctic, where I work with youth in Inuit communities who have entirely different experiences than the people I teach in the South, but whose voices are as impactful and as important in discussions about science. So I think we need greater diversity of voices so that all youth can find peers and allies that resonate with them, that they're willing to listen to trust. And I think we need to encourage curiosity and critical thinking in groups that may not be encouraged to do so, or who may not see any intrinsic value in it. And I think we need to find communication strategies that work with younger people. So as a very anecdotal example, I teach microbiology and immunology in undergraduate university courses. So two pretty important fields right now with the ongoing pandemic. And an approach I've taken to engage my students in ways that might reach them more directly was by including internet culture into my teaching. So I use memes, so these little humorous images that are overlaid with text. They're basically inside jokes, highly contextual to the current cultural climate, to engage with my students on what they've learned in the course, what's surprising to them, what they connect with. And even though I'm only, about 10 years older than most of my students, it's really surprising to me. It's shocking to me what reaches them. It's rarely what I expect, even though we're relatively close in age. And I'm really often surprised at how they incorporate this internet culture into their learning. They often get things out of the material that I wouldn't have gotten, but it shows that they're really engaging with the science. And anecdotally, again, these students in my groups report, sharing these memes that they create with friends who are not in STEM. And to me, this is great, because if this is a small way that I can help them build confidence in communicating and advocating for science, I feel like I've done, a big portion of my job, even if they're learning from a textbook that may have been published years and years ago. So this is a very personal example of how I try to tailor my approach to engaging with youth and finding communication venues that work with them. Donc, peut-être en conclusion, pour revenir au thème ici qui a été introduit par Jean-Pierre de Trusting the Messenger, je pense que la solution, c'est d'avoir plus de messagers pour parler avec les jeunes. On a besoin de voix diversifiées qui vont parler à des jeunes diversifiés de backgrounds, d'expériences variées. Puis de respecter en fait que ces jeunes ne sont pas un monolithe et forment un groupe très hétérogène. Donc, qu'ils poursuivent en fait une carrière en sciences ou non, c'est très important que les jeunes se sentent impliqués en fait dans la conversation scientifique. Il faut qu'on écoute et qu'on apprenne pour savoir, pour mieux connaître en fait qui eux, ils écoutent. Donc, je crois que c'est mon takeaway le plus important. Et puis, je vais peut-être laisser en fait les résultats du sondage être présentés, puis ça va me faire plaisir de revenir sur les résultats par la suite.
Merci mille fois, Catherine. Merci mille fois. C'était magnifique ce que vous avez dit. Vous êtes inspirante et je suis certaine que les étudiants et les étudiantes dans vos cours ont vraiment de la chance d'être inspirés par vous. Et j'espère que nous allons tous avoir au cours de nos vies des professeurs, des mentors comme vous. Alors, merci beaucoup. Alors, Sébastien, as far as I know, is still vice president of Ipsos and director general in Quebec. And we're going to just see, maybe his slides are going to work now. So hold your breath and we'll see.
Cette fois-ci?
Oui.
Oui, parfait. Donc, merci, merci à Catherine d'avoir attrapé la balle au bon. Désolé, on a eu un problème technique. Le logiciel me déconnecté à la dernière minute, donc je vous entendais plus. Thank you for being there, and I'm happy to present the results of this survey this morning. Important to know that the survey will be available in French as well. So the deck that I will present today is in English. Because the translation is not fully finished yet. As many things right now, we've encountered delays. That's pandemic life for everyone. And so I apologize for this. Désolé pour les gens de l'ACFAS. J'aurais vraiment aimé avoir une partie de la présentation en français aujourd'hui. Je vais présenter en partie en français, mais le document est en anglais. Before we start, I just wanted to correct one little thing in the intro, since we're talking about science and facts. I want to be factual. I'm not professor at Concordia University. If there are some people from Concordia, you may have gone look on the website. I lectured in the past at Concordia and as in other universities across Canada. So I have been involved in scientific communication in the past as well. So that's important, but I'm not professor at Concordia. So I just want that to be clear. So if we look at the survey and what we have done and why, and I'll try to connect this with the comments that we've heard so far that are extremely relevant to what we've heard. The survey was commissioned by the Canada Foundation for Innovation en partenariat avec l'ACFAS. What we wanted to do is to get a good sense of where youth go and find their information and how they think about various topics related to science. We've heard before that it's a complex issue, and trust in science, trust in scientists has a lot of impact on how people view the world, and that's with youth, and that's also with people who are older. But so the way we went about doing it is we did not strictly talk about science, but we used specific topics to see how their views related to how they viewed science and whether they were good at math and whether they saw the benefits of STEM. And so we talked about COVID-19 safety, since it's so important right now, sustainability and recycling, climate change, and as I just mentioned, importance of STEM in the future. We've talked to 1,500 youth aged 18-24 across Canada. We made sure that the sample was well balanced and representative according to age, gender, and region, to make sure that it was a good reflection of the youth population in Canada. The survey was done online, and field work was done recently, so mid to late October of this year. So what are the key findings? Just very quickly, we do so many things online. I just wanted to right away get to what stood out, and then I'll show you some more detailed results. So the first thing that we see is that science matters, which is obviously a great thing. A majority of youth hold opinions that are consistent with science, whether it's on COVID-19, single-use plastics, climate change, or the importance for Canadian politicians and governments to rely on science for policy decisions. However, as we'll see, there is some hesitancy. There are those who don't necessarily follow science, and they are present throughout. Again, reflecting some of what you've heard before from Philippe and Catherine. And so, youth are influenced by a lot of other factors. Despite the fact that strong majorities believe in science or hold views that are consistent with scientific evidence, they do come across influences that are not aligned with science. And that's very important. And more important in all this, because that's a key challenge for the future, is their information ecosystem is extremely complex. It starts with social media. As you'll see, social media usage is extremely high. And you're not going to be surprised by this, but the numbers might surprise you, which means that they're also more influenced by peers and people around them, whether in person or virtually. News and media play a role, not as much as for older generations, but it's still part of the mix. And uh, again, their own beliefs, their culture, and this is again something that Philip and Catherine have talked about. Influencers, they do play a role. And what we see in survey results is when we aggregate the proportion, whether we think about COVID or climate change or about plastics, what we see is youth are consistently coming across influencers who hold views that are not consistent with scientific evidence. And it's more likely to be youth who are maybe less involved in scientific knowledge, less informed, less educated, but it's pervasive. And so clearly there is a risk there. And when we think about groups that are at risk, and we've heard some of this earlier already, we see this in the survey. And we see it with young men, and that is very consistent with a lot of other research that we've done over the years, where young men tend to be generally risk takers, will reject advice a little bit more from other people. And I know I've been there. And so there is a bit of a gender difference in the results, but also those who have been less exposed to science for various socio-demographic reasons. Often it could be their family background, it could be cultural issues, but it just, the less you're exposed to science and the less you tend to go into higher education, then the more challenging it becomes to trust the science in many ways. And we see that in our results, religion does play a difference, with more religious individuals being less likely to hold views that are consistent with science. So very rapidly, I'm not going to throw a lot of numbers at you, just a few of the key ones. The report is a lot more detailed than this, but so when we think of COVID-19 vaccines, we know how much science matters and how people reacted to vaccines. And our scientific knowledge and acceptance, sorry, mattered in how people related to the vaccines. And what we see, the results are positive. Uh, 71% say that they got a COVID vaccine, or if they haven't, they plan to, mainly due to advice from public health officials. Another 7 out of 10 saying that they think the vaccines are safe. And when you look at those proportions, they are pretty closely linked to proportions of people in this age group who have gotten the vaccine. So they're very consistent. And where we do have a bit more of a downer is when we look at the last element. I don't believe the side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine are well understood yet. At the same time, we know that even experts in the field will say we still don't understand everything about the side effects and the longer term effects. So it's not a position that is necessarily that we should necessarily seen as a rejection of vaccines or a rejection of the science behind it, but clearly doubts are present. Nearly half of youth are expressing doubts. Now, when we look at, and we've heard before that youth tend to hang out with people who think like them. And we see it in the results here. In the first two rows, these are their views on scientific evidence about the safety of the vaccine and the fact that public health officials have effectively communicated the evidence that support the safety of vaccines. And very close to what we've seen before, about 2/3 believe that yes, science and scientists have done a good job at promoting this. But when we ask them also if people around them got the vaccine and people around them believe that the vaccines are safe, it's almost the same proportions. They tell us yes, people I know got the vaccine, And yes, people believe that they are safe in pretty much the exact same proportions as what they feel. So youth do tend to surround themselves with people who think and behave like them, or vice versa. I mean, obviously, the causation could go both ways. They could be influenced by people around them. So it goes both ways. So sorry if I want to be clear on that one. So, but we see this discordant note at the bottom, and it's consistent in the results that at least one of the influencers I follow has expressed a view that COVID-19 vaccines are not safe. So these influencers, and these again are the influencers that they follow. So it's not someone that they'll just stumble upon, but it's someone that they follow, have expressed views that go against scientific evidence. And when we look at climate change, we see very similar things, that 73% say that scientists have effectively communicated the evidence that climate change is a result of human behavior and activities. This is a result that's fairly consistent with what we find in the general population and not just among youth. Um, and very similar percentages. Most of the people I am close to believe that climate change is a result of human behavior and activities. So again, this is very consistent. You hang out with people who share similar views. But at the bottom, this 4 in 10 who again say that at least one of the influencers they follow express views that climate change is not the result of human behaviors and activities. So they are often and consistently exposed to views that go against scientific evidence. Now, when we look at the perceived value of STEM education, we see that again, a large majority of youth, even those who don't pursue or don't think they will pursue a career in one of those fields, do think that it will be important in the future. Good paying jobs will increasingly require an understanding of science, technology, engineering, and math. So there is a strong belief in this, that I'm pursuing or would like to pursue a career that requires a background in STEM. It's about half. So again, so you see, it's not the same proportion. So even those who don't go in that field, there are some who acknowledge that it will play a key role. But when we ask them, and more importantly, when we ask them whatever they think about going into it, or the importance of studying, do you think that science is a good field for people in your age group to go into as a career? Three-quarters say yes. So that's even stronger. So if we really ask them, do you think people in your age cohort, people you know, should they go in science? 77% say yes. And you there's an interesting point here, and I'll go straight to the third row. uh, I can tell real news from fake news. 64% of Canadian youth tell us that they can they can tell the difference from real and fake. But then right after, you see the last row: I have a hard time knowing what information I read online I can trust. It's 52% who agree with this. So it's not perfectly aligned with the previous viewpoint. In other words, generally speaking, they think they can make the difference between truth and fiction. But when you press them on whatever they see and hear online, uh, reality is not so simple. And I'll present in a minute results of segmentation we did, and what we see is the less youth are connected with science and scientific facts, the less likely they are able to make to understand the difference between what is true and what is not true. So it's really a key challenge. Now, and that, before I go to the next slide, very important. So when we say they have a hard time, half say they have a hard time knowing what information they see online they can trust. Well, when we look at the next slide, you'll see why this is extremely important. These are the things we ask them: how regularly do you do the following things. So they're all related to sources of information or exchanges. 40% of youth say they use social media, not just every day, but every day for 4 hours or more. Another 35% every day for less than 4 hours. And then the other two bars, several days per week, once or twice per week or less. So it means that on a weekly basis, 96% of those who answered use social media. So yes, the survey was done online, but it also represents the fact that, the vast majority of Canadian youth are spending a lot of time online. This may have been influenced by the pandemic because there were periods during the year where people were more at home. So it may have inflated those results a little bit, but still, it's staggering. We know they spend a lot of time on social media, but these results are very, very impressive. And then this is followed by watch streaming TV. And when we know the most popular shows and programs on streaming TV don't tend to be scientific shows. There are some, but algorithms tend to point you in same direction that you've gone before. So we know that the vast majority of what people stream is not related to science. And then the third one, read news online, but, and that's important, not directly from a news source. So again, it's algorithm driven. It's whatever they stumble into on Google or on Facebook or MSN News or whatever aggregator they go to. This is where they get the news from. And then friends and family, social media, and then this time, how much do you post on social media? And you see that again, there's a lot of interaction there. So all of this tells us that more traditional line of communicating about science don't really work with younger people. The way we talk about science, where we reach them, it's a very different information ecosystem than what we see with other generations. And again, for some of you, may be surprising when we ask them which social media they go to. And that's important. Again, it's Instagram and YouTube. It's not Facebook. We always hear about Facebook and the role of Facebook. And of course, it's important. But Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok play a big role. And then Twitter, less to a lesser extent. But it's really about Instagram and YouTube for a lot of youth. We did a segmentation of youth, and I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty of how we did it, but what we did is we segmented respondents based on their attitudes toward science and on various topics related to scientific knowledge. And we came up with 5 different segments. And I'll go in order from what could be considered maybe the core audience for scientific communication to the most difficult ones. And the first one we called promotes science. So this would be a young person who's a science advocate, is interested, believes in climate change, holds views that are consistent with scientific evidence. They represent about 17% of the population. They're more likely to pursue a career in STEM. They're more likely to be able to make the difference between fake news and valid science. And they surround themselves with people who think like them. So this is a reinforcing virtuous circle. Moving forward for them, it's really about empowering them to be opinion leaders, to be thought leaders in years to come, to really influence their peers. The second segment is what we call trusting science or trust science. These are individuals who struggle to be a bit more independent, and they lean towards science, but they are influenced by others. They feel the pressure to express same opinions as people around them. They're hesitant to step in when they hear inaccurate views. They feel embarrassed when someone knows more than them. So for them, you need to encourage them to to have the courage to speak up, the courage to really tell people what they believe and what is truth and what is fiction. So it's also a core group, but one that's a bit more hesitant. And then you have this third segment that we call follows science, that they're intimidated by science, but they do trust science and they do follow science. So they're not really good at math. They're not really, able to make the difference between what's new, what's not, what's real and what's not real, but they do believe, they do trust. So it's an interesting segment, and it's a segment to keep an eye on because this also means they can be swayed because they don't really have strong pillars on which to rest their opinions. And so moving forward, those people need to be more educated about science. And then the fourth segment questions science. They're independent thinkers who look at all sides of an issue. And this is a tricky one because they are more likely to hold views that are not really consistent with science, but they're not necessarily completely, on the outside looking in. They're just people who tend to question everything. They are contrarian in a way. So these are youth who will use their gut to make decisions, who will question truth, and they're not sure what, they trust that they know the difference between what's real and what's fake, but maybe they're not, because they may not be that connected. So it's a very tricky group, and moving forward, it's to find a way to connect them with scientific reality, connect them with facts that they will be able to use to basically change their gut instincts in a way. And the last segment is a group that is less likely to be connected to science generally. They don't necessarily challenge the science, but they're less aware. They hold views that are least likely to really relate to scientific evidence, but they're also surrounded by people who are not really connected with scientific facts. And that speaks a lot to what we've heard previously about the more vulnerable groups or at risks group or not of not believing in science. And it's all about finding a way to inform them. So I'll leave you in conclusion with just a few words from a respondent. So this was taken from the survey, and it's not a perfect quote. There are things in there that we can, say, oh, I'm not too sure I understand what they mean. But I thought it was a very good quote because I like what they say. At the end of the day, if the only people reading journal articles about climate change are the people who can understand the material, how many people are you reaching? And that speaks to some of the findings that we've seen in the survey, that they have such a diverse information ecosystem. They are exposed to things that are not consistent with science often, and many of them are difficult to reach, but they have to be reached somehow, and that's a key challenge moving forward. So I'll stop on that one.
Thank you so much. We're going to now have a little discussion among the panelists, but before we begin that, we got a few questions from the group that are listening to us, and they actually are kind of clarifications for you, Sébastien. The first one is more philosophical. What is the how do you distinguish between truthfulness and trustworthiness? Um, and I take it that would be from the point of view of a young person saying, I think they're telling me the truth, but I don't trust it.
Mhm. Wow, that's a difficult question, and Philip touched on this earlier when he presented the fact that
Mm.
youth can, um, you can believe in some things, but and no matter what happens around you, no matter what the facts are, you tend to revert back to your own opinion. So people will trust what matches their gut instinct. And your gut instinct are informed by your surroundings, by your environment, and so people who are surrounded with facts that may not really be truthful or may not reflect scientific evidence, they will tend to trust those findings, even though they're not really truthful. And it can go both the other way as well. So I'm not sure I'm entirely clear on what I mean by this, but there is a difference. You can believe something is true even if you're not sure where it comes from, simply because it matches what you already believe. So whether it comes from an expert or a layperson or a pseudo
Mm.
expert, it won't matter. You will believe it because it matches your preconceived biases.
If you go back to Bertrand Russell, who said that, if you can demonstrate the facts and demonstrate the scientific principles, people will believe and they will trust. But then if you look at what happened in the pandemic, we've moved to open science and rapid conclusions and discussions before we get to the final result. Things haven't quite been proven out. So you have scientists that are actually doing their very best to tell you what they found, but what they found is not yet conclusive. And so is there a problem that it's actually doing science live instead of reading it as a historical document? Does that cause a problem, or could that actually be more engaging for people? Maybe Catherine could say from her discussions with her students.
Well, I think we, in the past 2 years, we've been in a situation of construire l'avion pendant qu'on est dans les airs. We've had to react very quickly and produce science in an ecosystem that's already pretty much geared towards publish or perish. So, the scientific system is aligned with trying to get results out there as quickly as possible. And I think the urgency of the pandemic created a climate where things may have been a little more rushed. And from my perspective, with graduate students especially, there were a lot of discussions about scientific peer-reviewed publications coming out saying, can we actually trust this? This is a peer-reviewed paper in a journal, but it's come out so fast. Are the methods replicables, reproducible? So there was a lot of discussion in this, more science-aware group, if I can say, part of the Promote Science group, where they expressed some worry as to how quickly information was coming out. The flip side of that, I think, is for more of the general public youth. In my undergraduate courses, I got a lot of questions about, well, how are these vaccines being put on the market so quickly? How are we distributing vaccines when they typically take years and years and years to validate in these clinical trials? And for that, I mean, we had very solid explanations for it. We didn't skip any steps. We just parallelized a lot of the clinical trials. So I think for the general public, it was maybe easier to explain why this is happening so quickly. For science, STEM, career youth, there was a bit of a contrarian message.
Okay. Sebastian, there's another question that's really kind of devoted to you. It starts out in a way that makes me smile. And it says, before we all rush out and get on TikTok to communicate with the youth, did you find that youth saw social media generally as a trustworthy place to hear about science? Or when they talked about podcasts and scientific programming on television, for example, did that seem to them did they have deux poids deux mesures? Was one worth more in their minds than the other?
What we see in the results, there are a few. I wouldn't call them contradictions. I think it just speaks to the challenges for youth to figure out what is real and what is not real in their online environment. And we see that when you ask generally about news, can you make the difference between what is real news and what is fake news? They are more confident than when you ask them whether they can see the difference when they're online. And knowing that they get a lot of their news online, that is worrisome, because and they don't get their news from often from main news sources, but they will get them from aggregators or from social media or from friends and from peers. So that's a core challenge moving forward. Help them navigate this mountain of information to so that they can make the difference between what's a good scientific source and what is not a good scientific source. That clearly is a key challenge moving forward, because it's not clear for them. And I think the risk is that some of them feel very confident, but then when we look at some of the answers, maybe they shouldn't be so confident about some of these things.
Jean-Pierre, there's a question that's really probably up your alley, and that is that we see that the social media influence young people, but also their milieu. How do we educate the parents and the teachers and the other adults who may have an influence on young people? I always like to say it's a lifelong education. It's never too late. I'm still trying. But what would you say? I think you're on mute.
I'll say that you're right. We have to continue to communicate about science, to use different way to communicate, but we have to encourage people to believe in science. There's not miracle that can be done, but more we promote and more the people agree that science are important. And I believe that the pandemic has been a very good moment for that. And now I guess that people have a better feeling for the science than what it was before this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Does it make the role for teachers be bigger and beyond the classroom? And how do you reach that bigger audience?
I think you're touching an interesting point. Using the teacher, using the educational system to reach the parent, it's certainly one way to go. And there's no perfect formula for that, recipe for that, but we have to use all the way that all the possibilities that we have. And the school is one place, but even the communications, TV show, radio, social media. More we're talking about science, I think, and more we will reach all the populations.
Mhm.
We cannot say no on that. It's a question of democracy also. It's a way to say good democracy to talking about science and facts and not only opinion.
Mm. Well, I always say a woman's work is never done, but it sounds like a teacher's work is never done, a professor's work is never done. We've got our class, we've got our publications, we've got our inventions, and we've got to reach out to the rest of the world too.
For sure.
And if I could add on this point, when one of the reasons why a segmentation like the one we did is useful is because we know we tend to hang out with people who think like us, and we tend to believe people who we connect with. And when Philippe mentioned that evidence, often scientific evidence, and even if we think of climate change, you can have floods, you can have people living, for example, in the southern US, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, bigger than ever. Despite the fact of all this happening, there's a portion of the population living in, I don't know, Florida, South Carolina. Their views on climate change are not changing because the scientific evidence just filtered by everything else that they believe, that they've internalized, and they will maybe believe it for a little bit, then they'll move on back to where they were. But the way to change opinions is to get the people they trust around them to change the discourse, to change what they're exposed to. So when we think about our 5 segments, our first 2 segments, who are the people who are the strongest believers in science, who are those who have the tools to really make a difference with their peers, the more we empower them to change the discourse, the more they feel confident about what they talk about, the more they will end up influencing these other segments. And that's the way that over time we can improve the situation. And the good thing is that young people have a more open mind than often older generations who will not move out of their existing social circles. Youth will evolve and they will go in many different places and their viewpoints may change.
Sébastien used an important word for me, that is encourager. we have to encourage people to trust science. And that's a very key point.
So, Sebastian, some 20 some years ago, I set up a course in the United States for all the young people entering this one university. So 5,000 people had to take the same course on the environment because I thought that was really going to be an issue of the future that would be important for everyone. And they all took it. But there was a handful, a small handful of students that protested having to take a course on the environment. And so I went out and sat down with them. They were all young men, which is sort of what comes out of your survey too. And I said to them, why don't you want to take this course? What is wrong with it? And they said, because it makes us feel guilty, because we want to have a really fast, fancy car. We want one of those ones with those giant wheels that goes rum down the road. And that's our dream. And we really don't want to be told we can't have that. So maybe the only solution is to create great big cars that have no pollution.
Well, in a way, is the new fancy luxury fast electric cars. That's exactly what they tap into. They try to get people to do what's right for the environment, but in a way that contradicts a lot of what we think should be the right environmental attitude. So it's not about fast cars and about powerful things and very expensive toys, but it makes people like electric cars. So you target an audience that may not be very likely to do things that would favor reducing GHG emissions, but it does by a different in a very different. You use a very different route to get to a similar point. So yeah, it does matter.
Philippe, is there anything in this survey that really contradicts what you found before that causes you to think? You're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute. Oh, now you can hear you. We've got you. Uh, so, um, so while Philippe is thinking about that, Catherine, was there anything that Philippe said and that you heard Sébastien say that kind of choqué and didn't quite click for you? Contradiction?
Maybe from looking at the report and again, what is really reassuring to me is that even if they're not really good at teasing apart what is science and what is pseudoscience, youth know that both exist, which is a distinction that I think is really important. That if we have that at least out there, I think c'est déjà un gain. And to me, when I saw the results initially, I thought, oh, this must be because of the pandemic. This must be because we've been talking so much about fake science, pseudoscience, and how to distinguish it, that I felt that maybe if we'd done the same survey 3 years ago, the results might have been very different. But from what Philippe was saying, not necessarily. So I was curious, Sébastien, Philippe, if you think that the current pandemic affected this ability, or the ability to which youth reported that they're capable, or that they're recognized that there's fake science and actual science?
What we see in general, if I think of all the other research that I've been doing, general population, not just with 18 to 24-year-old, the pandemic played a huge role for sure. Trump played a huge role as well. This whole discussion of fake news, fake science, fake facts, alternative facts certainly has influenced the results in some ways, because they live in the same information environment than we do, and so they hear same things in different ways from different places, but similar messages certainly come across. So yes, it has had an impact. But I would think that this is probably lasting, because yes, we keep thinking of a new normal eventually in our lives will change again. But I still think that this is the new reality we're going to be living in for years to come. And whatever youth are going through right now, it will follow them for years to come. So it's a mix of both. Yes, it likely made a bit of a difference for results themselves. And probably we would not have asked the same questions were it not for the pandemic. And we know we wouldn't have talked about vaccines for sure, but even just the way we relate to science and evidence in our everyday lives, it's so much more top of mind right now that yes, it has an impact, but it's likely to be lasting.
Actually, when you say that, that bears out what Philippe found that, years later, an episode during youth still played out on people's feelings. Jean-Pierre, I'm not going to, unless he raises his hand and lets me know he's connected. But Jean-Pierre, if the current generation is impacted, and we think in our minds out to when they're going to have children, what are they going to, what is going to happen to society when they share their views with their children?
That's a very tough one, this one. It's not new that part of the population is not believing too much in science. So, we were there, we still there. So I think that we have to look the situation by the other angle, and really communicating more about science, but maybe also communicating about how the science is made. Maybe we're not doing enough on that. And if people understand the process of science, the process of research, why it's important, it takes time, etc. Maybe they will more appreciate the importance. The facts is, you see, maybe that's the way to go. I can believe, because for most of the people, that are not believing in science, they don't really understand how we're doing an experience, how it is designed, and what is the value of a project, and why it takes times to be sure it's confirmed, etc. And maybe that's an important issue, in fact, to progress.
Rebondir là-dessus, I feel like that is something that we've seen so much in the public discourse about how new data is received. Scientists are always changing their mind. They're changing their minds about masks and about vaccines and about this and that. And we need to show people that it's not a case of changing our mind. It's new data becoming available, and that we re-examine the data and course correct. And I completely agree with you, Jean-Pierre. I think we need to do a better job of explaining what it is that science is and how it works.
Philippe, is your mic on? Still can't hear you. Okay. Well, I'm going to learn how to read lips for the next time I do a session. In the meantime, Jean-Pierre, what do you have to say? Oh, are you frozen too? Aha.
You're talking to Philip or me?
No, now I'm talking to you. You were almost going to say something when we tried to let Philippe cut in.
Yes, I was on a point to say, that it's like when you're doing a survey, finding the truth, it takes times. Mm-hmm. And, if let's say that you have a criminal scene, the policeman who arrives on the scene is not finding the truth right away. He has to ask questions, etc. And that's a lot about science. It's like that. And that's one of the reasons why it takes time. But eventually, we will have the perfect truth that will be based simply on facts.
Mm-hmm. So, if I could just jump on this now, I think that's another important factor that we have to think about, and it's a big challenge for science, but for democracy as a whole, is our collective attention span and the attention span of young people who spend a lot of time on social media go from one app to the other really fast. And we see it in all our spheres of everything we do. Even the music industry has changed so that the first 5 seconds are more recognizable. Otherwise, people just switch. And so that's the real difficulty for scientific evidence. It's hard to present scientific evidence in 3, 4, 5 words. It's very easy to destroy scientific evidence with 2, 3, 4, 5 words. And that is an extremely important challenge. So we have to learn how to make things a lot simpler, a lot easier to understand, but it often goes against our scientific background because we don't want to cut corners and we don't want to oversimplify things, but opponents of science, they do. And so it's not a level playing field, and it's a very tough battle to win because it's much easier to destroy than to build. And same thing for trust in general. Trust in institutions, it takes a long time to build that trust, but it takes a very short time to lose it. And any big organization or any individual who makes a mistake, and if we think during the pandemic, some individuals who've raised views that really did not either make much sense or should not have been said. Sometimes it may have been just an afterthought. Sometimes it's a deeper belief, but the swiftness at which people's reputation gets destroyed, it's it's really scary when you think of the years it took to build them. So that's a really big challenge moving forward.
So,
And there's one thing, Rosanne, that's important to mention. I believe that all the institution, organization, university, college have a very important role in this part. We're very good to promote our success. How many times do we see news? You read the newspaper and you see there's, someone published in Nature, but we forget to explain why it's so good and why it was in Nature or Science. We're mainly in the promotions rather to teaching or
so there's
using the opportunity to teach what is good, etc., how it has been performed. And Sebastien is right. We need more than 4 or 5 words to teach something.
So we've got this one word in the survey. It's a 4-letter word. And I was always taught not to say 4-letter words, but this one is MATH. It seems to be a word that doesn't please everyone. Is there anything that you would suggest that we can do to rehabilitate the reputation of that 4-letter word?
Maths could be fun also.
There's a lot of there's studies done in kids and in school children that show that there are a lot of confidence issues associated with learning math, that not everyone feels the way you perceive that you will perform in math will impact how you succeed in evaluations. So I think it all comes back to diversity and making sure that, everyone gets a leg up to feel welcome and feel like they have value in the science conversation, but also that, math is for everyone. Everyone can be good at math. It's useful. La question qui tue, c'est toujours, mais à quoi ça sert? Donc, il faut montrer à quoi ça sert, les mathématiques. Il faut mieux l'expliquer, mieux le valoriser pour que les jeunes se sentent attirés par les mathématiques. Et puis, this link in the survey, Sebastien mentioned it, that, performing poorly in math was associated with not being able to distinguish between fact and fake, feelings of embarrassment and anxiety. I mean, that's something that we really need to deconstruct because that's bigger than just, how we teach math.
Mhm. C'est très important ce que Catherine vient de mentionner sur connecter les mathématiques avec le quotidien. C'est quoi l'utilité des mathématiques? Pour tous ceux qui ont fait des mathématiques avancées, il y en a beaucoup sur l'appel ici. Des fois, ça devient très théorique, ça devient difficile de vraiment voir qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec. Et pour les jeunes, c'est très important. Et dans mon expérience universitaire, où je n'enseignais pas les sciences, mais j'enseignais les méthodes de recherche scientifique à des étudiants en sciences sociales dans différentes universités. Et c'était souvent des étudiants qui ne voulaient pas faire de mathématiques, qui ne voulaient pas faire de statistiques. Et la façon de les motiver dans le cours était de leur montrer à quoi ça servait. Et très souvent, j'entendais Ah, OK, là, je comprends. Now I get it. Et là, ils devenaient motivés et là, ça allait bien et ils faisaient les liens. Mais même pour des étudiants universitaires, c'était pas toujours évident de comprendre pourquoi j'aurais besoin des chiffres pour comprendre la société, pourquoi j'aurais besoin d'être capable de faire une corrélation ou une régression pour mieux comprendre les choses. Mais quand on pouvait vraiment leur faire voir ce que ça voulait dire d'une manière très, très concrète, là, ça devenait réel, ça devenait plus intéressant. Et donc, ça, c'est au niveau universitaire, mais bien avant ça, pour les jeunes à différents niveaux, c'est connecter les mathématiques à leur avenir. Oui, on entend toujours, oui, mais il faut connaître les mathématiques pour pouvoir être astronaute, pour pouvoir faire des choses, pour être ingénieur, pour pouvoir faire des choses extraordinaires plus tard, mais ça demeure très abstrait par rapport à la réalité, le quotidien de beaucoup de jeunes. Et c'est important de faire ce lien de manière plus claire, plus concise.
I would love to clone you all and put you all across the country, and it would solve all the problems that we have. Thank you so much for a wonderful session, for your brilliant ideas. Survey is fascinating and gives us room to think, improve, and do better. So thank you so much.
Merci.
Merci. Thank you.
Beaucoup.
All right. See you guys. J'arrive à la fin.